improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Carry On Podcast, SITREP edition. I am Brad Colbert, the Iceman, and it has been an extraordinarily busy week. We have a lot to talk about, but before we do, I just wanted to encourage everyone to check out our Patreon as we have exclusive content that is not available anywhere else. We will be releasing my one-on-one with Ray Person, after hours, drinking, bullshit, telling stories, and you can get a brief preview of that tomorrow. And for those of you that would like to learn more and enjoy more, that content is available for our Patreon subscribers. And thank you to those of you that have already made that commitment. As I said, it's been an extraordinarily busy week for news events, and there were several stories that caught my attention, yet they were eclipsed one and all by the major announcement that the Trump administration put forth with their national security strategy. It was bold, it was brash, it was everything that you come to expect about the Trump administration, and I want to dive into it and some of the second and third order effects that strategy is going to impact probably for the next 5 to 10 years. Before I do talk specifically about the national security strategy, I would like to frame the NSS, as we're going to call it, with a little bit of context. And in order to do that, we have to go back to 1947. And don't worry, we won't stay there very long. Nobody wants to be a history student this evening. So let's briefly talk about where the creation was, and then we'll jump forward again and keep it topical for the rest of our discussion. So back in 1947, there was post-World War II construction. There was a lot of policy shifting, a reorganization. One of the big things was the creation of the National Security Act. And in that National Security Act, it formally codified the National Security Council, which is a group advise the president, advise the administration on national security matters, and make and help craft strategic policy. It also created the Central Intelligence Agency. Heretofore, it was the OSS. Great, rich history there. If you're a history buff, as I am, that is a fantastic topic to explore for a later date. And it also unified the Department of Defense. Prior to that, it was the War Department. How things have come full circle because we seem to be back with the Department of War. So all that being said, 1947, we had the National Security Act come to fruition. And in that, we had the National Security Council that put forth the very first policy document, NSC 6.8, which really was the top secret and arguably the first true national security strategy. It outlined how we were going to fight the Cold War and all of the isolationism in favor of massive military buildup, change, rejecting what had been done for decades past, and basically it brought us into the Cold War. Now, fast forward into the 80s, and in 1986, there was a congressional law that was passed that mandated that the administration publish a national security strategy every year that they are, or at least once a term, essentially. So this is unusual in the sense that our sitting president is a two-term president, but not a two-term consecutive president. So we get to look at what his national security strategy looked like his first term, and then leapfrog over Biden and take a look at the current one. Before we do, understand there's been essentially 5 phases that the Americas has gone through in the context of a national security strategy. And they can pretty much be distilled down into 5 basic media-friendly sound bites. So 1947, the attitude was, we need to be everywhere to stop the Soviets, and we consider that to be containment. 1990, we won the Cold War, so let's make the whole world look like us. Enlargement. 2001, we're under attack, so we'll strike first. We call that preemption. And then 2017, the other guys are catching up, so we need to compete. Rivalry. And then, of course, current, we have 2025. We're overextended, so let's focus on our own backyard. Neorealism. So the National Defense Strategy, as currently published, it was quite the showstopper. There's ripples that are being made all over the world. I've read a couple of things from French reporting that has their reaction, some from Germany, some from the UK, and I read an article a couple of days ago on the Polish front. All of them are pretty shocked, on their heels. Unfortunately, Russia likes it, which means that it's not the best. But essentially, it formalizes America first. It takes all of the bombastic statements that the Trump has made throughout his tenure as second term and really halfway from his first until now, all of the things that he's been telegraphing during the campaign, and it locks them into a doctrine. Essentially, the Western Hemisphere comes first. Europe is downgraded. We find stability with Russia, whatever that looks like, hard deterrence towards China, and a sharp pivot away from a liberal internationalist language in democracy, climate, and human rights. Now, I have struggled to find a crystal clear definition of liberal internationalist language, but as near as I can figure, putting it in Trump terms, it's anything woke. He really does not like elites. He does not like liberalism, and I'm not a fan of it myself, so I certainly empathize with his statements there. But he has taken all of his individual philosophies and cobbled together this national security strategy, which really reflects a lot of his views. But understand what the national security strategy isn't. It is not a step-by-step guidebook in how to apply foreign policy. It's more of a white paper. It sort of telegraphs what the administration's internal philosophies are. It's a lot of cut and paste work. If you read the 33-page document that is available open source, you can kind of see where each cabinet official has put their DNA or thumbprint on this document. It is not also tied to any budgetary constraints. So as much as the document makes bold statements about what our country's future is going to be, there's still a logistical tail behind it that has yet to be funded. And that is going to be a long slog, especially as we come up to the midterms. Back to the NSS. So it argues that the previous U.S. elites sacrificed American interests to abstract global projects and a network of international institutions, quote unquote, allegedly hostile to sovereignty. It frames Trump as the corrective, restoring borders, tariffs, and military strength. Make no mistake, the national security strategy as published has a lot of Trump-isms. There's a lot of self-aggrandizing, there's a lot of bold statements, and there's a lot of language that probably makes a lot of liberals cringe, and a lot of his base wave the flag again. I found bits and pieces of it to be exceptionally well written. I found certain sections to be contradictory, and then I couldn't cringe hard enough at others. I'm not exactly going to broadcast where in a 33-page document each one of my aforementioned emotions lie, but let's go through it and maybe you can kind of infer through some of the context. So the key themes here are sovereignty over multinationalism, multilateralism. International institutions are acceptable only when they serve narrowly defined U.S. interests. Anything that constrains United States freedom of action is suspect. Power is the new norm. Power, especially military and industrial, is treated as the basic currency of security. Values and rules-based language is marginalized, something that the U.S. State Department is bristling from, by the way, and more on that later. Domestic culture war is now a security issue. In case you haven't been keeping score, woke is dead. And the last nails in the coffin were personally hammered in by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. I'm not exactly opposed to this. The strategy explicitly frames radical gender ideology and woke extremism as threats that weakened the military and foreign policy establishment. I kind of agree with some of those things. Folding U.S. domestic culture fights into the national security doctrine. I don't necessarily know if that's the place for it, but let's move on. Understand that this is a huge break from the 2022 Biden national security strategy, which put alliances, democracy, and climate, as well as global rules at the center. The most radical shift is the elevation of the Western Hemisphere to top priority. For those of us that are a fan of history, this is sounding extraordinarily like the Monroe Doctrine, and it is. They are calling it the Monroe Doctrine with a Trump corollary. And it's easy to see why, because now the U.S. will assert and enforce this corollary to keep the hemisphere free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets. Heretofore, our current strategy has been deterrence, denial, containment. It's been a whole host of things, but we haven't pivoted towards the Western Hemisphere in almost 100 years. So it is refreshing in some ways, and it's shocking in others. The aim is to prevent mass migration, secure supply chains, and of course, deny China, Russia, and Iranian economic or security penetrations within Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have already started to do that, and the news has been riddled with indicators of that. So what this does is it legitimizes a long-term U.S. military and intelligence buildup in the Caribbean and Latin America, not just episodic operations. So if you're watching these boat takedowns, and I'm sure you are because we just managed to take down an oil tanker, this is going to be the new norm. And I think the lines between air, land, and sea, and sovereignty and borders are going to be blurred more and more. It greenlights more aggressive economic and political pressure on regional governments seen as pro-China or pro-Russia. One of the modus operandi that China loves to do is buy up foreign debt. And when you become indebted to China, they basically have this quid pro quo. We will buy your debt, and in exchange, we would really appreciate having a port or an airbase, or we'd like infrastructure, or, oh, by the way, here's this wonderful camera system that we can provide for you. Of course, we're going to have access to it, and we're going to be testing our new facial recognition algorithms on it. And oh, by the way, have you seen this waterfront property that we have in Colorado for sale as well? It's pretty much what they do. Russia does the same thing. They just do it in a much more thuggish way. It reframes migration control as a quasi-military mission, not a humanitarian or developmental challenge. And that's going to have massive implications for our southern borders. And it's also going to involve a lot more of our uniformed men and women than it ever has before. So if you were worried about the National Guard being called up to patrol the southern border, just wait until you see what we have coming for you next. Now, that's the basic meat and the potatoes of the national security strategy. It is pivoting towards the Western Hemisphere, constricting our obligations overseas. We're no longer looking at strategic confrontation with China and Russia as much as we are, you do you, we'll do us, stay on your side of the street, and we're going to get along fine. Europe is the redheaded stepchild in this national security strategy. They get pushed to the side, and they get pushed pretty hard. There's a lot of European presidents, parliament, senators who are looking at this and really sweating. Because whereas before we had alliances, we are now putting the burden on them almost entirely. So for the State Department, this means Western Hemisphere bureaus move from supporting actors to the main stage, while diplomats in Europe are now operating under a doctrine that treats their closest partners as semi-adversarial on values and domestic politics. The national security strategy, as I said, where it comes to China, as the primary external rival, but emphasizes deterrence and tech competition over regime change rhetoric. For example, reinforcing alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and bolstering U.S. presence along with First Island chains. Taiwan still is our red line. The strategy commits to deterring Chinese use of force, deepening defense cooperation, and aims transfers with Taipei. Now, China immediately denounced this, shocker, and reiterated that Taiwan is its core sovereignty issue. I don't think that's going to be the case. If you were not aware, Taiwan is the largest manufacturer of chips on the entire planet. And what do you think we are currently talking about every single day that uses an assload of chips? Artificial intelligence, absolutely the next frontier in our great expansion of technology. And Taiwan is sitting on the center of gravity for all of that. So no, China, you're not getting Taiwan. And that's the one thing that I can pretty much guarantee that we would go to blows over. The Golden Dome and the high-end missile defense. So the national security strategy folds Trump's space-based Golden Domed missile defense concept into its vision of staying ahead of Chinese and Russian long-range strike capabilities. If you've been listening to my podcast for the last couple of months, we have talked in separate broadcasts about all of these individual puzzle pieces, which seem to be coalescing into this very interesting puzzle picture. We've talked about AI, we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about small nuke reactors, micro reactors. We have spoken about minerals, rare earth. All of these things are coalescing into this grand future battle landscape. So, Taiwan, definitely a red line for us, while China can squawk all they want. Our tech and industrial containment strategy emphasizes resilient supply chains, AI and semiconductor dominance, and selective export controls, which is funny because even now, Trump just announced conditional permission for NVIDIA's H200 AI chips to go to China with a hefty fee to the United States. So this is one of those areas where the NSS seems to contradict either practical reality as it's playing out in real time, or even contradiction itself within the NSS. So Europe comes in a clear third. The core message for Europe is that Europe is rich, soft, and not pulling its weight. The national security strategy criticizes not just EU regulations, but migration policies and speech norms as weak and illiberal in their own way. He has had nothing but vitriol for immigration, migration, call it what you will, but the influx of groups of people pouring into Europe and Europe's absolutely lax asylum rules allowing them to repopulate, at least for this administration, is a sticking point. Speech norms. You've noticed that there are a lot of language police in other parts of the world, political correctness. The term sort of morphs in each year, but there's a lot of PC that took place over in Europe before it was exported wholesale to the United States, or maybe it was the other way around. I'm not exactly sure, but either way, he had a lot of criticism for it. In fact, the erosion of Europe is one of the things that Trump used, and it definitely struck a chord with a lot of our allies in the European Union. Traditional shared values rhetoric is replaced by transactional expectations, such as higher defense spending, support for U.S. industrial and tech policies, and alignment with the Trump corollary in the Americas. It's one of the things that we had always had with Europe, which is strategic partnerships. They agreed to throw their weight behind our decisions if we agreed to provide strategic security promises. And it looks like that might be shifting. On Russia, the document emphasized strategic stability. Now, this is where I definitely disagree. I am an old school, dyed-in-the-wool anti-communist. Anybody in the audience that ever had to do a duck and cover drill for a nuke strike understands what the Cold War was about and understands that Russia is not somebody that we can really trust. But in the pivot towards the Western Hemisphere, I don't know if you study geography, but they're not in it. And so they're not going to be given much thought. Strategic stability, conflict termination in Ukraine more than defending aggression or restoring full sovereignty, which means stop fighting and freeze in place. No wonder the Kremlin is surprisingly responsive to the NSS, calling it largely consistent with the Russian vision, although they did get strongly slighted militarily. The document slams their military, and if not for their nukes, they might have been a footnote in its entirety. The NSS explicitly states the Middle East is no longer a top strategic priority, arguing that U.S. energy independence and conflict trends reduce the region's centrality. And to be fair, we haven't seen a whole lot of national threats on the terrorism strategic front. And that's probably because we have this gorgeous concept that I've talked about before, defense in depth. I'm not exactly sure I want to constrict our strategic view back to the Western Hemisphere if it means abandoning the Middle East entirely, but until an existential threat rears its head, this is probably where our strategy is going to lie, especially when we move into how the Department of War, a la the Department of Defense, is extrapolating the NSS. But more on that in a minute. So, several moves contradict the idea that it is peripheral. The document cites Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike that obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons capability, or did it? The jury's still out on that one, actually. But it claims it was a key success, reduced the Iranian threat. And as I said, I have my own thoughts on that. Gaza. Trump's ceasefire plan and de facto partition, marked by a yellow line the Israeli commanders now treat as a new border, effectively endorses a long-term territorial and governance re-engineering of Gaza. Both of those things seem somewhat antithetical to Trump's Western Hemisphere pivot, stating that the Middle East is no longer important. But as I said, there are a lot of contradictions within the NSS, and this is just but one of them. So the region is deprioritized for day-to-day attention, but not for big disruptive interventions, which is a dangerous combination. Less patient diplomacy, more episodic shock events. Okay, we'll see how it plays out. Now, what about Africa and the rest of the world? Okay, it's a fair question. Africa and the other regions are treated mostly through great power competition, such as pushing back China and Russia, migration control, and access to critical minerals and supply chains. There's really little emphasis on governance, peacekeeping, or development beyond their role in limiting migration and Chinese influence. If you're seeing a theme, the theme is migration. There's tremendous emphasis put on it. There's also tremendous emphasis put on woke, anti-liberal ideology, but a lot of things that weave throughout the tapestry is migration. Okay, moving on. So there's going to be several cross-cutting tools that dominate. One, massive defense spending and the Golden Dome. We've talked about the Golden Dome in previous episodes, and it is still on the radar. In fact, there has been a lot of work in not just proof of concept, but in budgetary alignments. You had the chief of the Space Force before Congress very recently defending the $100 million that is being spent on developing and implementing the Golden Dome and how it is going to flesh out. Congress wants more transparency. They are saying that transparency is not ready to be broadcast yet, that it's limited towards one-on-one discussions with industry. More on that in the future as we follow that development. But the NSS casts Trump's increased military spending and space-based missile defense as the backbone of American power. And in some ways, he may very well be right. Space is absolutely the next frontier. Not to be too cliche about it, but whether it's exploration or resources or military dominance in this case, it absolutely is the next battlefield. Industrial policy and the tariffs. Well, security is defined as control over production. Tariffs to force reshoring and punitive economic tools against adversaries and free-riding allies alike. Tariffs have not seemed to work very well for this administration. It is a tool that is extraordinarily effective, but only when you reserve it for a worst-case scenario. If you take it out of its break in case of war glass each and every day, it no longer has the sharp edge that it needs to make the surgical cuts that you want. Migration and border militarization. So stopping the invasion, their words, not mine, but I'm not happy about it. Maybe it's my words too. Hold on, let me think about it. Yeah, it's my words too. There you go. I owned it. of migrants is treated as a national security objective, not a primarily humanitarian or legal one. Again, this dovetails with the Monroe corollary rhetoric. And lastly, culture war as strategy. A lot of the NSS spends unusual space attacking woke elites, globalist institution, and critics from American enterprise. Everywhere the document argues it's more of a culture war manifesto than a true strategy. But again, don't read too much into the NSS. It, in and of itself, is basically a white paper telegraphing the philosophy of an administration and how it views the United States and its place in the world over the next 5 to 10 years. It is up to the other cabinet sections and the other branches of government to extrapolate their marching orders based off of that overarching guidance. Then you've got to find the money that funds it all. And of course, there's plenty of political fight to be had at each and every step of the way. So, how serious observers are reading it? Well, expert reactions are remarkably aligned on a few points. Atlantic Council and CSIS analysts see the NSS as a sharp ideological and substantive break with the post-Cold War consensus, which is alliances are downgraded, global order language is stripped out, and sovereignty and unilateralism are centered. Not a bad thing when you really come right down to it. I'm not necessarily opposed to focusing our energies on America, and then when we're good and fixed, we can play world police again to the rest of the world. But I hope that doesn't deter Matt and Trey from not making a America World Police movie 2. Please, we're ready for another one. It's been time. War in the Rocks highlights the Trump corollary and the Western Hemisphere pivot as the single most jarring innovation. Foreign Policy, which is great, and I love their writing, their lead piece calls the NSS a moral and strategic disaster, arguing it prepares the U.S. for a culture war, not the actual security challenges of the 21st century. The mistake that they're making, though, is taking the Trump administration the same way they would take any other sitting president. Trump is an anomaly, a one-off, something that the algorithm didn't account for. So Foreign Policy, as much as I love their publication, a lot of the, I hate to say it, elites that write a lot of those articles, they don't know what to do with a guy like Trump. You have to take even something as bold as the NSS with a granule or two of salt and understand that read it at face value, sure, but let's see how it fleshes out over the next couple of years before you start becoming apoplectic. The European community, wow, they're focusing on the sense that the U.S. is now openly hostile to the EU project and willing to meddle in European domestic politics. A lot of the EU has already told Trump, and I'm paraphrasing here, stay the fuck out of our business. It's nothing to do with you. We're happy to help. We love being in NATO. We'll champion a righteous cause when it comes along. But meanwhile, we're sovereign. Fuck off. I kind of get it. I'd probably do the same thing too if another country decided that we needed to de-wokeify. Now, the Russians, by contrast, publicly pleased, saying the NSS is largely consistent with Russia's vision, especially in Ukraine, and in skepticism towards Europe. Now, when your adversaries praise your strategy and your closest allies fear it, that tells you a lot about where the leverage and risks now sit. So, that is the parent document, from which the two biggest cabinet positions craft their department policy documents and their vision. So let's start with the U.S. Department of State, because that's the one that is going to most immediately feel the reverberations of a document as boldly striking as this one. So under Biden, State was nominally the architect of a rules-based order, alliances, climate agreements, global health, democracy support. Now, under this NSS, State is pushed more towards transactional deal-making, migration safe third deals, bilateral industrial and energy bargains, military access agreement that serve Monroe corollary enforcement, execution arm for the White House-driven moves, not co-author of strategy. The real grand strategy locus is clearly the White House and the Department of War leadership, not Foggy Bottom. What can you expect from the U.S. State Department moving forward? Well, the National Security Council staff and a tight Trump head-Seth Rubio inner circle to dictate the lines, and then state implements it, cleans up, and provides a legal and diplomatic cover. Inside state, wow. Okay, this has only been a week, and already I've talked to a few people that I know that are foreign state officials, and the pulse inside state it's abhorrent. They're not happy. They don't like Trump. They certainly don't like what's taking place globally. And as executors of the foreign policy, they're not happy. Most of the State Department personnel are populated by people who didn't vote for the administration. So it stands to reason they're not going to be pretty happy about it. If you look for Trump derangement syndrome, after the USAID folks, you go to U.S. Department of State. And don't get me wrong, they serve a very important function in the United States government, both domestically and abroad. I'm not slandering everybody, and I'm actually not slandering anyone. I'm simply saying that they're not happy about this, and I kind of understand why. If you are in the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs, or WHA, you're in good hands because you're now going to become central. Whereas before you had a pretty boring job, now you're going to be tasked with leaning on governments that host Chinese ports, working on 5G, mining and rare earth projects. We've talked about that before, central towards a lot of the things that we are going to be moving towards in the future. You're going to be negotiating migration control and safe zone deals, supporting expanded U.S. basing, overflights, and naval presence in the Caribbean. And the Atlantic overall, really, all linked to the Trump corollary. If you're in East Asia and the Pacific Affairs, or EAP, you're going to retain high importance, but with a narrower, harder brief. Taiwan defense, for example, access and basing, tech supply chains, and coordination around Golden Dome and missile defenses in the Pacific. One more thing about the Golden Dome, remember it's not all space-based. There's a lot of ground-based operations involved in this as well. And if you want a robust Golden Dome, you're going to have ground stations that are pushed out pretty far, and a lot of those fall within that theater. Now, the European and Eurasian affairs, or EUR, boy, are you getting downgraded. Less about alliance management, more about burden shifting and pressure, demanding higher defense spending, pushing energy and tech deals that favor U.S. firms, and engaging with nationalist parties. Diplomats will be asked to sell a line that many European elites see as hostile. Morale in these posts is already under stress. Morale. I'll tell you, they are not pleased with this. Near Eastern affairs is struck with high intensity but low priority tasks. They're going to manage blowback from Iran strikes, Gaza partition, Saudi-Israel alignment, without the political capital or sustained attention to actually build durable settlements. Lastly, Africa affairs will be evaluated primarily on how well it limits Chinese and Russian influence, secures minerals, and again, here it is, counter-migration deals, not on governments, not on development. Considering the fact that we no longer have the soft diplomacy power through the U.S. aid, it is going to be really interesting to see how Africa settles out in this new landscape under the, Monroe Doctrine 2.0. So if you're a career diplomat, you either move into WHA or EAP to be near the action, or you accept that your portfolio is now secondary. So, state's culture, up till this point, has been built on alliance-first thinking. For 70 plus years, that's what the U.S. Department of State primarily does. Brokers deals, builds alliances. So being ordered to treat the European Union institutions as obstacles and to work more with nationalist or anti-EU forces cuts directly against that. As I said, I would expect internal resistance, leaks, and quiet non-compliance. If there wasn't a deep state before, there sure as fuck will be now. Most of state, I'm telling you, has Trump derangement syndrome. Russia and Ukraine, wow. This is just so upsetting to me because Russia was really on its back heels. It may not look like it. And if I was to tell you that the folks on the front lines of the Ukraine campaign don't think that way. It certainly wouldn't blame them, but the sanctions that we have levied against Russia are cutting, and they're cutting deep. You may not see it from the state-sponsored friendly media line, but the Russian on the street is absolutely demoralized. They've lost almost 1 million human beings of Russian alliance with this campaign. That's a lot of men. That's a lot of people's children that are no longer coming home. And that is something that, well, at least the Russian state news organization really hasn't talked a lot about. If there were breadlines before, there's even worse breadlines now. There's a lot of stagnation that is taking place over the last almost 3 years of conflict with the Ukrainians that really isn't being broadcast. And it was working. And what this does is it settles. It appeases. And it's very upsetting to me because I think as much as the Ukrainians are motherfuckers, they were fighting a just war. So this strategy that the State Department is now going to have to apply puts pressure on Kiev to accept a Russian-friendly deal. And the state's going to be on the front of pushing that on partners who see it as a capitulation. And that's a recipe for ruptures with Poland, the Baltics, and parts of NATO. If they see what happens right on their doorstep and that the U.S. basically threw them to the wolves, it doesn't bolster confidence that Article 5 is actually going to be enforced if it's ever stress test. And then Gaza and the great trust logic. The informal border in Gaza and the trusteeship style reconstruction schemes, the Great Trust, well, it requires diplomats to defend a partition that contradicts prior U.S. commitments about non-annexation and Palestinian self-determination. And that's going to be lethal for the U.S. If you thought that our support of Israel has created a next generation of guerrilla warfighter, terrorist, freedom fighter, call it what you will, stand the fuck by because it's about to get a lot worse. Culture war inside of the U.S. Department of State. When the NSS frames internal woke enemies as a security problem, you're implicitly inviting purges, loyalty tests, and political vetting inside state itself. Critics are already warning that the NSS is more about domestic culture enemies than geopolitical adversaries. State is going to lose experienced officers through early retirement and resignation. That's a feature, not a bug, for the ideologues who wrote this. So, the state tools that they're going to be leaning on most heavily is sanctions and tariffs as routine bargaining chips, applied not just to adversaries, but to allies who defy U.S. industrial or migration preferences. I don't like tariffs being used as a weapon in this way, but it is somehow seen as effective to the administration, and regardless of whether it is truly bore fruit, it is going to continue to be thrown. Security assistance as leverage, such as arms, training, and intel access, all preconditioned on alignment with the Trump corollary in the Americas or on a harder line versus China in Asia and Europe. Bilateral mini deals over multilateral frameworks, more bespoke compacts with individual states, fewer big multilateral treaties or institutions. And lastly, information operations and political shaping. Increased pressure on embassies, both friendly, midterm, and adversarial, to cultivate relationships with nationalists, anti-EU, or anti-establishment actors seen as more aligned with Trump's view worldwide. And all of this pushes state towards a hard-edged, unsentimental, sometimes openly interventionist style of diplomacy in others' domestic politics. Exactly the sort of behavior Washington used to condemn Moscow and Beijing for. Bluntly, strategic risk, sidelining these alliances, attacking the European Union institutions, and pleasing Moscow, well, it may buy tactical wins, but long-term, it erodes coalition structure that makes the U.S. power scalable. States' comparative advantage has always been coalition building. This strategy burns that capital. And an institutional risk, a politicized, culture war State Department, loses professional memory. local expertise, and internal dissent, and the very things that stop presidents from making catastrophic errors. You also have, through the loss of a lot of our State Department subsets, a la USAID, soft power erosion. You can't run a trusteeship in Gaza, pressure Ukraine into a bad peace, browbeat Europe, and prop up strongman in the Americas while still selling yourself as the guardian of freedom and the rule of law. State will be forced to mouth lines that nobody believes. There's so much more meat on this bone. We could talk about the U.S. State Department for a lot longer and the second and third order effects of the NSS going forward and over the horizon. But for the moment, let's leave state here and simply end with the fact that strategy is coherent on its own terms, but it's strategically myopic. It trades slow, boring coalition work, which is the thing that State Department does, for short-term theatrics and ideological purity. And over time, that makes the job of any serious diplomat harder, not easier. But let's move on to the main course, shall we? The Department of War. I don't know, the more I say it, the more it's got a nice ring to it. So last Saturday, what is that, the 6th? Yeah, 6th of December. At the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, lovely place. If you have a chance to go, I highly recommend it. Not Simi Valley. I'm talking about the Reagan Library. It's pretty nice. Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of War or Department of Defense, I don't know what to say anymore, just told the world that the old America as a global social worker phase is dead, and that the U.S. is shifting to a hemispheric, transactional, sphere of influence doctrine. This is everything that we've been talking about this evening up until now, but it is the Pentagon's take on it. So it isn't a coincidence that this took place where it did, as he is explicitly tying his doctrine to Reagan and his peace through strength philosophy. And during the Cold War, it worked. It'll be interesting to see if it works in 2025. It's being described as both officials and friendly media as the public preview of the new national defense strategy. And of course, it's tightly linked to the national security strategy. We're going to look at it in 3 pieces, and we're going to go through it fairly quick because it is developing. We're probably going to revisit this topic again. And honestly, I really want to get to the new Department of Defense Pentagon-wide AI program. So 3 things: what he said, how mainstream versus independent outlets are reading it, and what his real underlying intentions likely are, especially regarding the Western Hemisphere and Europe. So from the official War Department brief and multiple outlets, the centerpiece phrase is this: out with utopian idealism, in with hard-nosed realism. He defines utopian idealism as a post-Cold War democracy promotion, such as nation-building and grandiose interventions like Afghanistan and Iraq. Utopian idealism is further defined as open-ended military commitments with abstract values rather than strict U.S. interests. So he is explicitly attacking the bipartisan foreign policy consensus from the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and even parts of early post-9/11 GOP. The unclassified War Department brief on war.gov, God, I fucking love that domain. I should have bought that and then monetized it and sold it back to him. I'd be so rich right now. Anyways, it lays out his 4 pillars very cleanly. Defend the U.S. homeland and its hemisphere. What does that look like? Well, I think we've already seen it, don't you? We've got 10,000 troops and a major naval asset in the Caribbean and the nearby waters. We're blowing up boats left and right. Intensified anti-drug, anti-smuggling, anti-migration. Oh, wait, it wasn't the last one. Sorry, it's just anti-drugs and anti-smuggling. We haven't blown up any migrants yet. But don't worry, we're working on it. Including lethal strikes on drug boats, they've already killed 80 to 87 people with allegations of follow-up strikes on survivors. We just pulled over a large tanker, as I said earlier, and Venezuela's not happy about that anyways. Heavy focus on the Panama Canal, regional sea lanes, and limiting Chinese-Russian influence in Latin America. Hegseth connects the strategy directly to border security, expanding the military's role at the U.S.-Mexican border as part of national defense, not just domestic enforcement. This is a revived Monroe Doctrine with a muscular, militarized twist. The U.S. asserts a dominant sphere of influence in the Americas and expects others, such as China, Russia, and Iran, to stay out. I can dig that. We're going to deter China through strength and not war. And now this is a departure for me, at least from a strategic standpoint. The 2018 author of the National Security Strategy was a gentleman by the name of Eldridge A. Colby, and he was in the first Trump White House. He wrote a fantastic book called The Strategy of Denial. And no, denial is not a river in Egypt. In this context, he's talking about preventing somebody else from doing a thing, denying them, specifically China. Great book, strongly recommend it, and I happen to agree with a lot of the things that he puts forth in that book. And it is certainly not what we are seeing from the national security strategy and, by matriculation, the national strategy of the Pentagon. Maintaining overmatch in the Indo-Pacific, especially Taiwan and the South China Sea, but stop talking about regime change or democracy promotion inside of China. Now, in many ways, I don't disagree with that. The problem that I see is in application. How on earth are you going to overmatch them in the Indo-Pacific if you are predominantly pivoting towards the Western Hemisphere? I don't know. We'll leave that one alone for the moment. Increase burden sharing with allies like NATO and other allies, bluntly told to pay more and do more, or accept a reduced U.S. security guarantee. Basically telling Europe, you're on your own, mostly. Now, Hegseth does praise Poland and a few high-spending allies, which is classic wedge strategy. Reward nationalist governments while pressuring the broader EU. Polish and other European outlets read his speech as essentially telling Europe, time to fend for yourself. I don't necessarily disagree with Trump's push towards getting all of our NATO allies to quote-unquote pay their fair share. I guess the question that I most am left with is, what exactly is fair? They all signed up to spend a certain percentage of their GDP on national defense, and I think they should be held to it. After that, well, they're sovereign nations, they'll figure it out. Supercharging the defense industrial base. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts as well. We're talking about large funding increases unseen in previous defense spending bills, especially for AI-enabled autonomous weapons and advanced systems. Hegseth boasts of a historic boost in funding and explicitly touts AI weapons that take human fingers off the trigger. We're going to wrap up this evening's podcast with a discussion on AI, and we're specifically going to talk about human fingers off the trigger. Okay, so that's what was said. Now, how is the media perceiving this, at least domestically and some of it abroad? Well, your mainstream outlets like Politico, Financial Times, Reuters, AP, Time, and AOL. I still have an AOL email account. They're still relevant. They all converge on a few core themes. This is a major strategic realignment. It's not just a speech. The doctrine downgrades Europe and prioritizes the Western Hemisphere. It accepts a more multipolar sphere of influence world, explicitly reviving the Monroe Doctrine and hinting at respecting Russia and Chinese near abroad in exchange for them respecting ours. Now, there's serious legal concern around the Caribbean boat strikes and the claimed breadth of presidential authority to use force there. But that one will be adjudicated throughout the courts and, to a lesser extent, public opinion. Now, your right-wing pro-Trump media groups like One American News Network, Postmillennial, and Fox cast the speech as a restoration of Reaganism after neocon betrayal, a necessary purge of wokeness, weakness, and war from the Pentagon, and a bold plan to rebuild the arsenal of freedom, especially via AI weapons and industrial expansion. Now, going overseas, European and non-U.S. independent outlets, Polish public radio, European commentary, and some global outlets highlight the time to fend for yourselves tone toward Europe. alarm at the civilizational and demographic language in the NSS, which lines up uncomfortably with far-right rhetoric. Now, online, political blogs, social media, and even Reddit discussions are focusing on the risk that ending utopian idealism is code for we don't even pretend to care about human rights anymore. Now, that's not exactly true, boys and girls. We care about human rights. We only care about the human rights of people that we like. Don't get it twisted. Concerns over purges inside the military leadership and the ideological reshaping of the officer corps. Okay. Again, keep your panties on. The part you really care about, what's beneath the surface here? Well, the Western Hemisphere focus plus the Monroe Doctrine plus the boat strikes equals one thing. The U.S. is preparing to run America's like a militarized backyard again, and the implications are pretty apparent. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexican cartels, they all become primary justification theaters for kinetic action. The boat strikes in the Caribbean, well, they're likely the first test of public tolerance for lethal force under this new framing. If there's a limited domestic blowback, well, then we can expect more strikes. And when you frame it as an anti-drug border security, it gives a simple domestic sales pitch, even if the operational footprint looks a lot like low-intensity warfare. Well, we're finally using Europe as a bargaining chip and not a partner. And I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing, but then again, Europe can fend for themselves. They just don't like to. For far too long, the United States has played world police, and they have been sucking on a pretty fat tit, and that tit's about to dry up. The National Security Strategy and Hegseth's speech treat Europe not as a co-equal pillar, but as something between a client and a problem child. The problem I have with this is that it's not burden sharing anymore. As I said, it's burden shifting. And in doing so, you abandon the core bargain that has sustained U.S. alliances, American security guarantees in exchange for that alignment. So, in addition to all of these bold policy shifts, it really consolidates control over the military. His broader pattern, and not just this speech, has shown that he is firing or sidelining senior officers he tags as woke or DEI hires, renaming the department war, and stylizing himself explicitly as a political warrior and not a neutral manager. Remember, our founding fathers crafted this architecture of a layer between the top military generals and the president with a civilian oversight. That civilian oversight is supposed to be impartial. When that impartiality starts to erode, it's a slippery slope. And I'm not saying that we're even on the precipice. I'm just stating what is potentially there is incongruity that doesn't lend itself well towards cooler heads prevailing in conflict. Moving forward. So you can't ignore the money. The speech was delivered in a room full of defense contractors, Capitol Hill staff, and donors. The Reagan Forum is the place where policy meets funding, and Hegseth links the doctrine directly to a historic boost in defense funding, AI and autonomous weapons programs. A lot of the people in the audience are those that are either going to find the money or approve it. So it was speaking towards his core base. Expanded production for hemispheric deployments is another one. You are going to have the logistics behind all of these troop movements, and that has to come from somewhere. So what does all this mean? It means that the strategy is a contractual redesign of the military-industrial complex around hemispheric presence, AI weapons, and reduced heavy land forces for Eurasian occupations. I don't know what that's going to mean with our basing overseas. Do we draw down? Do we realign? Do we reshift assets? Or does everything stay the same and we just create more for the Western Hemisphere? I don't know. But once that pipeline is fully built, any president will have to fight both Congress and industry to change course. Understand this. We're still in the first year of the Trump presidency, give or take. by the time the next administration takes over, a lot of what's laid down is going to be really hard to unwind. So I hate to say this, like it or not, you got to lean forward into this because this is the direction it's going, one way or another. So where this likely goes if it stays on track, well, move this forward. More kinetic activity in the Caribbean and Latin America, drone strikes framed as anti-drug, anti-terror, or protection of shipping. Like I said, we just saw an oil tanker get seized. Higher risk of accidental escalation with Venezuela or other regimes under U.S. or economic political pressure. Europe moves forward towards strategic autonomy, even clumsily, regardless of whether they want it or not. They're going to have to accelerate their own defense structures. They're going to have to less out of confidence and more out of fear that the U.S. won't show up. Interesting, because they're currently funneling a tremendous amount of infrastructure towards Ukraine based off of the NSS and its other document that we're talking about now, and states, true. Are they going to constrict a lot of that towards Ukraine back to their own borders? Are they going to create more? Are they truly going to ramp up their military industrial complex to pick up the slack that we're now giving them? Well, I don't know, but we're definitely going to be watching that over the next couple of months. Normalization of civilizational framing in security documents. Man, that national security strategy, it really talked a lot about civilization erasure. And once that becomes standard, it's easy to justify drastic policies at home and abroad as existential defense, not just policy disagreements. A more openly transactional, less value-based United States foreign policy, fewer interventions for democracy, and more deals with authoritarian partners who deliver resources, basing rights, or migration control. If you strip all the branding off, what Hegseth just announced is a hemispheric fortress doctrine, a downgrade of Europe from sacred alliance to conditional client, a green light for expanded, loosely justified use of force in the Americas, and a rewiring of the defense industry around AI and regional dominance. And ending utopian idealism, it's the story they're using to sell that shift to the public, to allies, and to the people whose budgets depend on it. Okay. So that's everything that we're going to talk about regarding the Pentagon and their extrapolation of the national security strategy into the national defense strategy. We talked about the U.S. Department of State and what their marching orders are most likely going to be in light of this pretty groundbreaking document. So let's end with something that I'm really excited to talk about for so many different reasons. It's both exciting, horrifying, and just riddled with hubris. It's this one piece of the puzzle that I've been trying to fit together over the last few months. And all of the stories we have talked about, like I mentioned, are falling into place nicely because they interconnect so well. Whew, I'm going to need a sip. Oh, this is High West, by the way, their campfire expression. It's a blend of rye, bourbon, and Scotch whiskey. And as weird as that sounds, it's not bad. It's got a nice smoky, scotchy, rye, bourbony. All right, moving on. So this Tuesday, the Pentagon announced they're rolling out this embedded AI at an enterprise level across the DoD, and it's called GenAI.mil. It's not a toy. It's not a pilot program, and it's not a proof of concept. This is the absolute first attempt to wire essentially the entire U.S. military workforce into frontier-grade generative AI at scale on a .mil domain and to normalize artificial intelligence as part of the daily battle rhythm. And when we talk about frontier grade, frontier is a euphemism for cutting-edge artificial intelligence. I mean, the best of the best, right? And as you can expect, the most expensive and brightest companies that have these products are part and parcel of this package. So what is it exactly? Well, according to the official War Department release and parallel industry reports, it is a new bespoke AI platform for the United States Department of War designed to host multiple commercial frontier models like Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI, all behind a .mil boundary. That's never been done before. This is really, really groundbreaking that this was announced. Now, the first tenant is Google Cloud's Gemini for government. I've been using Gemini for me. I can only imagine what Gemini for government looks like. I no longer have .mil access, but as soon as this thing is hot, I definitely want to talk to some people that are still logging into a .mil account and ask them a ton of questions about how this is interfacing. And it's deployed at an impact level 5, which you can Google on your own. Essentially, it means it's cleared for controlled unclassified information and tons of day-to-day operational workflows. So the Pentagon's Chief Technology Officer, Undersecretary Emil Michael, says that, and I quote, "For the first time ever, 3 million employees, warfighters, and contractors are going to have artificial intelligence on their desktop, every single one," end quote, via genai.mil. Hate the name, by the way. It's meant to create an AI-driven culture change that will dominate the digital battlefield for years to come. And it was really only a matter of time. I mean, James Cameron's not the only person that can look at a crystal ball and realize that Skynet it's coming. Google's own description, though, they give a little more detail. What they're saying is that it's going to summarize policy handbooks, generate compliance checklists, extract key terms from contracts, things like that. It's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting on the admin side, which I don't have a problem with. It's going to help create risk managements and risk assessments for operational planning. And oh my God, thank you. Thank you. I hate ORMs. I fucking hate them so much. That was one of the worst things that I ever had to create when I was in any position of leadership, was an operational risk matrix. Okay, I would have paid any sum to have had this done for me, so God bless you so much, Google. What else going to do? Oh, it's going to automate onboarding, repetitive admin, contracting workflows. Yeah, we talked about that. Again, all in a sovereign IL5 environment. And none of the data is going to be used to train public models. So that was the agreement that they made with the providers. You can't come back and glean. We're not a test bed. So it sits on 3 years of bureaucratic groundwork. This has been worked on for a while. All the way back in August of 2023, there was an artificial intelligence rapid capability cell called Task Force Lima, stupid name, and they were stood up to analyze and integrate generative AI tools across the Department of Defense to really sort of flesh it out, see what worked, see what the capabilities are. Is it user-friendly? So over a 12-month period, it analyzed hundreds of AI workflows. It boiled them down into 15 use case scenarios grouped into basically two main categories: warfighting functions such as command and control, decision support, etc., and enterprise functions such as finance, health, IT, human resources, and logistics. It concluded that it's cheaper for the DoD to lean heavily on commercial frontier models and focus internal R&D only where commercial tools are insufficient. Now, I've worked in the acquisitions community. One, I was on active duty, and I understand a lot of the challenges and complexities that come with acquisitions. And so I actually, for once, applaud the acquisition arm. I think that that's the smart way to do it. If there's a commercial off-the-shelf solution and you don't have to create from scratch, yeah. And plus, the government sucks at creating things, even when we task it to industry. I probably shouldn't have said that. All right, moving on. So in December 2024, Lima was canceled, replaced with the AI Rapid Capabilities Cell, or AIRCC. And their mandate was to run pilots and then scale generative AI across those 15 use cases. And they had about $100 million worth of funding across the FY 24-25. So the the AIRCC I don't know who comes up with these. It's run jointly by the CDAO and the Defense Innovation Unit. Its job takes Lima's concepts into enterprise deployment. And that's where we are now. So back to GenAI.mil. That is the delivery mechanism for the RCC pilots when they're ready to scale. The press release explicitly frames this as fulfilling President Trump's mid-2025 mandate to achieve unprecedented AI technological superiority. But what's interesting is a lot of this work was done before he took over. But regardless, the warning is there's no prize for second place in a global race for AI dominance, end quote. Now, Defense Scoop confirms that it follows and builds upon recent directives from President Donald Trump for America's government and industrial base to achieve global dominance in AI. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, the United States owns 60% of the AI infrastructure, with China owning the rest. It is absolutely the strategic asset in 2025, well into 2035. Gen.mil is the doctrine-aligned infrastructure, not just IT modernization. It's how they're going to operationalize AI superiority as a daily reality inside the Pentagon. Now, in parallel to this, DUI and Scale AI are building Thunderforge. Like, really, who has been asked about these names? We used to have really cool kick-ass names for a lot of these programs. Thunderforge. It sounds like something I'd find at... Never mind, moving on. Thunderforge is described as, and I quote, the first foray into integrating AI agents across military workflows to provide advanced decision-making support, focused on operational and theater-level planning. Well, what the fuck does that mean? The Washington Post reports its mission is to help commanders plan and execute, not the Washington Post's mission, Thunderforge's mission. It helps commanders plan and execute movements of ships, planes, and other assets, drafting op orders and summaries initially in Europe and Indo-Pacific theaters. Now, again, I'm loving this. I think this is great. I think this is super exciting. It definitely off-ramps a lot of admin, day-to-day burden from the individual warfighter and puts it into an AI task list. And I think it's great. There's so much just routine, mundane bureaucracy that I firmly believe artificial intelligence can help alleviate by taking this burden off people's plate. So if GenAI.mil is the horizontal AI layer for everyone, Thunderforge is one of the vertical operational tools that will increasingly plug into that ecosystem. And look for more as we move along over the next couple of years, more of those vertical operational tools that exist in the horizontal AI layer. So in the next 2 to 3 years, what can we expect from GenAI.mil? What can it actually be useful for right out of the gate? The Pentagon and Google provide enough detail to extrapolate some of these workflows that we've talked about so far. So drafting and editing policy memos, orders, RFIs and RFPs, compliance checklists, risk assessments, which we've talked about, contracting language, and statements of work, all capable of being generated with and edited by GenAI.mil. Now, on the administration and the human resources side, huge help there, right? Helps with onboarding packages, training plans, performance bullets, awards, fit reps, and OERs. Not exactly sure how I feel about this, you lazy motherfuckers. When I get a fitness report, I want you to put a little bit of thought into it. It was lazy before in some cases. Oh my God, it's going to be like velvet daggers left and right in this flowery language. Anyone who's used artificial intelligence at least once, you understand what I'm talking about. It is so sycophantic. And now all that sycophantic language is going to be bundled into a performance review. So much for critical feedback. On the admin and logistics side, we have consolidating requirements, summarizing technical specs. Love it. And then, of course, in the IT field, it's going to be huge. AI assistance for internal software teams. It's going to shave hours of staff work from millions of people. And I think this is where AI is incredibly useful and incredibly needed. Now, here's where we start to get towards the middle ground of our march towards Skynet destroying us all. Intelligence and sensing, right? So Emil Michael is quoted as saying a major category is intelligence use cases. We have a lot of intelligence that we get from satellites and so on. We don't analyze this, and a computer probably could do all that, end quote. Yeah, no fucking shit. It doesn't take anybody with a graduate degree to understand that. So if you were not paying attention, and there's no reason why you should to this next fact, roughly 80% of all of the intelligence reports that we generate, they're never read. It's just, it's information overload. The United States has so much great intelligence, and it doesn't matter what the vector is, whether it's HUMINT, SIGINT, ELINT, OSINT, it doesn't matter. But there's really no good way to aggregate it and find what's useful and what's not. And many people have tried algorithms. Hopefully the use of artificial intelligence overlaid is going to have a huge impact on and over these didactic algorithms heretofore, which is what we were using, right? So I think this is long overdue. What can we expect? Multimodal analysis of satellite imagery, drone video, text intel reports, SIGINT summaries, automated tagging and triage, drafting of intel briefs and threat summaries, and cross-correlation between theaters. This is going to be incredibly useful. And the Army already talks publicly about generative AI for intelligent decision support systems and aided target recognition to support decision-making and casualty care. So GenAI.mil, it gives them the enterprise plumbing to make these tools routine rather than bespoke. So between the AI RCC's warfighting remit and work like Thunderforge, and COA GPT, yeah, you knew that was coming. Here's where we start the slide towards the inevitable codependency on AI. And this is where I'm starting to get somewhat of the sky is falling. Not a lot, just a little bit, okay? There's no tinfoil coming out yet, but stay with me. So COA, generation and refinement. Remember, COA is course of action. Research like COA GPT already uses large language models to rapidly generate doctrinally consistent courses of action from mission inputs and then iteratively refine them with commander feedback. Okay. I'm not opposed to it as long as we have a little bit of critical thinking that's still applied. Okay, so far so good. Campaign planning and wargaming. Thunderforge aims at AI-assisted campaign planning, simulations, and agent-based wargaming, enabling commanders to navigate evolving operational environments at near machine speed, as well as operational decision support. So we take sensor and intel feeds, proposing asset movements, logistical options, and branch plans. And GenAI.mil is how all of those niche tools stop being toys in a lab and become part of everyday staff work at combatant commands. What this implies for the future of warfare. Okay, still with me so far? Good. Okay, because here's where it starts to get exciting and terrifying all at once. We're talking about the OODA loop moving towards machine speed. For those new to the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. It is Boyd's OODA loop, this concept that was created by an Air Force officer that describes the decision-making process that takes place in our brains, essentially. Whether he was a fighter pilot, then he applied it to a fighter pilot mentality, but it doesn't matter. It applies towards business, it applies towards sports, and it certainly applies in warfare. Every serious military planner talks about decision superiority and compressing the OODA loop. GenAI.mil plus Thunderforge plus COA GPT type tools mean that your OODA loop now looks like this. Observation. AI helps digest ISR and OSIN. highlighting anomalies faster than human analysts can. AI then fuses that multi-domain inputs of intel, logistics, cyber info into coherent narratives and dashboards. That's your orientation, your decision. AI proposes a COA, branch plans, and then risk trade-offs, and even can draft orders. The action. Remember we talked about finger on the trigger? Okay, bro. This is where the finger is still on the trigger, but people are starting to wonder, why does it need to be? Because under action, execution systems such as C2 platforms and autonomous systems are already being wired for further tasking. What happens if we have a fleet of autonomous aircraft? I'm not talking drones. I'm talking about basically, let's call it a purpose-built F-16, but not an F-16, something, that doesn't have a cockpit, that was never intended to have a human occupant, being wired into this infrastructure. So when the OODA loop ends at action, they execute. I guess another way to say it is, I'm worried that the man in the loop is not going to stay in the loop, and that this thing can radically spin out of control. But we're not talking about killer robots yet. It does mean that command chains whose tempo is increasingly gated by model throughput, not human brain cycles. I think it's fascinating. I think it's incredible. I think it's definitely going to happen. This is the future. It's here now. My fear is that, are we mature enough to apply the technology? Is the technology outpacing our not just understanding, but our ability to use it? I mean, we have screwed up an entire generation of human beings with cell phones, social media, instant information access. We're now going to be giving an entire generation of warfighters an AI tool that they could potentially abdicate responsibility to with lethal consequences. All right, I'll put a pin in my alarmism for a minute, and we'll finish talking about some upsides and downsides. If it works, the upside: faster responses, better exploitation of fleeting opportunities, potentially reducing friendly and civilian casualties if targeting and deconfliction, generally improve. But the downside, what I'm talking about here, is if the system is biased, fooled, or fed bad data, everyone still moves fast, but they move fast in the wrong direction. There's less natural friction in the system to slow a bad decision before it cascades. So I looked into this with a little greater detail, and they're hyper aware of these same worries. Like, I'm not the guy that came in and invented fire. There's a lot smarter people than me who are asking these same people or these same questions at every echelon, at the technology and development, at the application, at the war colleges. And there are checks and balances. My fear is that the generation that is currently wearing the uniform now is that hybrid in many ways. At the senior level, they didn't grow up with computers. They came into them later in life. They were not raised on cell phones. They were introduced to them much later in life. Artificial intelligence is new to all of us. At a certain point, the men and women wearing the uniform will have grown up with incredibly fast computers, instant access to data, and an artificial intelligence that they've known their entire lives. They're going to be much more trusting of AI than we are. I don't want to lose that delay in a decision built into the problem set now. I don't want to lose that, because it gives you time to think. It gives you time to second guess the AI. But don't worry, people were thinking about it. When was the last time anyone in government said, don't worry, we're here to help? Well, yeah, that's what they're basically saying. Foreign Affairs, the ICRC, and a lot of others, all right, are echoing what I just said, that large language model-driven systems, they're brittle, hallucination-prone, and vulnerable to adversarial manipulation. All of these traits do not mix cleanly with nuclear thresholds. escalation ladders, or complex battle spaces. So the staff, the doctrine, and the homogenation problem that I've been talking about is being addressed. And we'll explain here in a minute how it's being addressed before we bookend this whole subject. Another unintended consequence is if, like I said, if 3 million people reach for the same AI tool, then staff products start to converge in style and structure because the model is the author and not a person. You get automation bias, whether it's junior officers and even colonels and generals default to, well, what does the model suggest? Because it looks polished and it's perceived as objective. Doctrine can end up implicitly encoded in prompts and fine-tuning, not just in field manuals and human training. So that is efficient and strategically dangerous because you reduce the system's diversity of human thought and dissent in staff work. You risk systemic failure models where a subtle modeling bias or a poisoned data source can skew an entire campaign's planning assumptions. And we, as I said, collectively abdicate responsibility. AI Now and other critical researchers have been explicit. The rush to embed generative AI into military decision-making is happening faster than the field has solved accuracy and robustness for safety critical use. And I kind of tend to agree. I don't want to slow roll the implications and the implementation of artificial intelligence, but I don't know if allowing it to compress the OODA loop to machine speed in lethal arenas is the right thing to do yet. We'll get there. I hope. I'm almost out of my alcohol, so I hope. Yeah, okay. So moving on. Let's finish this up. Jen.mil's impact on the intel, it's not just speed, though. It's way more than that. It's coverage. And when you get sufficient computing, models can continuously, in real time, ingest ISR streams, OSINT, that's your open source intelligence, comms, metadata, internal reports, all of it. In theory, giving the U.S. a near continuous machine-digested picture of multiple theaters. As intel is collected, it's fed into the model in real time, and it's processed, and it's constantly spitting it out. And the temptation is to treat that fused picture as more objective than human intel, even though it inherits all the biases and blind spots of its training data. On the offensive side, generative AI, it's already being pointed at influence in psychological operations, and analysts warn that AI-driven propaganda and disinformation is going to be a major threat of conflict. If you thought that videos like Sora and others were convincing, can you imagine what AI-driven propaganda on the battlefield and disinformation is going to look like in a major theater of conflict? You end up in a battle space where machine-generated sensing feeds machine-generated analysis, which supports machine-shaped decisions delivered at tempos humans struggle to fully audit in real time. That's a very different war structurally from anything in Iraq or Afghanistan. So all of this forces something that was already de facto, really, is that the U.S. warfighting capability is now entangled with the success of a handful of commercial AI and cloud companies. CDAO already has large contracts with OpenAI, Anthropic, xAI, Elon's company, Google, and ThunderForge involves Scale AI, Microsoft, and others. The chip and data center stack behind these models is now explicitly part of the U.S. strategic capability. As the think tank work on AI, semiconductors, and military power keeps hammering. I will say this, and I said it earlier, Taiwan, you know that they've got to be sleeping well at night now because their sovereignty is absolutely guaranteed. And the implications of all of this, the industrial base of artificial intelligence, chips, power, data centers, cloud infrastructure, becomes as strategically important as shipyards or missile factories. Any disruption in the supply chain whether it's cyber or political, kinetic, to those firms directly cuts into U.S. decision-making capability in war. You don't just get AI at arms race, you get a platform dependency where you risk losing access to key models or infrastructure becomes a national security vulnerability. There's a bunch of human rights, and whether it's the ICRC, the UN, and other human rights groups are freaking out about all of this, talking about autonomous weapons and stressing the need to preserve meaningful human control over life and death decisions. And NGOs and analysts warning that generative AI in weapons and surveillance systems is being rolled out without any clear accountability mechanisms if biased or erroneous outputs lead to civilian harm. GenAI.mil, though, doesn't yet put lethal autonomy on autopilot. It just normalizes AI as the default filter on operational reality. And once that mental shift is baked in, the line between decision support and effective delegation can blur very quickly in a crisis. That's what concerns me. Not that this isn't needed, but how fast that line can blur. And the Pentagon is actively betting on the speed and scale of AI augmented decision-making, outweighing the risks of hallucination, bias, and vulnerability to manipulation. They're basically saying, fuck it. We're willing to take the risk because the rewards are so great. Now, I think that they're going to continually improve, and a lot of these fears are going to be mitigated, but it also needs to pace with how fast it's being integrated into the overarching architecture. I don't want it touching our nuke triad. Leave that one alone and keep it good old-fashioned, air-gapped, 14K baud rate modems with the telephone on the cradle. You know what I'm talking about. Commercial frontier models, adapted via wrappers and governance, are good enough for most military use cases below top secret, and it looks like that's where they're staying. And our adversaries are going to do this anyways. So not doing it is strategically irresponsible. And to put it bluntly, as I said, they'd rather risk being wrong faster with AI than slower without it. And they feel they can build in enough safety guide rails to survive the failures. Okay. Best case, worst case, most likely scenarios. Best case, according to them, GenAI.mil dramatically cuts the bureaucracy and it frees up capacity for real thinking and training. Intel cycles speed up. Commanders get clear, more timely pictures of the battlefield. Planning tools like Koa GPT and ThunderForge improve options analysis, highlight risk, and reduce human error. And fewer civilians die because of the targeting, deconfliction, and battle damage assessments are more accurate and they're better audited. The U.S. will continue to maintain a decisive decision tempo advantage over Russia and China, and that helps enforce deterrence. Now that's best case. Here's worst case, and this is what everyone is bellwethering about. This is essentially an over-reliance on artificial intelligence. It creates systemic automation bias, whereas there's no dissenting human voice is listened to. There's no 13th man. Our adversaries will also learn how to poison our data sources and craft inputs that exploit model weaknesses, nudging decisions in subtle ways that we aren't able to detect. And in a fast-moving crisis like, Taiwan or the Baltic, an AI-driven misinterpretation of intent or capability leads to escalatory moves like a mistargeted strike, a misread mobilization, or a premature preemptive posture. This compressed OODA loop that we talked about, it gives national leaders less real time to recognize and correct errors before crossing irreversible thresholds. So most likely in the near term, again, we talked about this 5-7 years. This has become ubiquitous for staff work, intel summary, and planning drafts. actual lethal decisions will continue to remain formally human, but they're going to be heavily shaped by AI-generated analysis and options. There's going to be fewer publicized events, but a few of them will creep through, and there's going to be some AI screw-ups. There's going to be bad summaries, misprioritized leads, but not enough to slow the overall rollout. And the United States, China, and Russia, and others are going to quietly converge on a norm of AI-saturated command chains while publicly reassuring everyone that humans remain in the loop. Okay. So remember a while back, we spoke of the man in the loop for all kinetic strikes. Well, this is where that line becomes blurred and possibly removed. Possibly. In other words, warfare becomes more algorithmically mediated long before it becomes fully autonomous. That mediation itself shifts towards power, tempo, and risk. Anyways, this is needed. This is exciting. This is risky. And I think that every serious analysis, including DoD's own internal work and independent critics, admits that current models hallucinate, they have bias, and they're vulnerable to adversarial attacks, but they're going to proceed anyway. And this is all tying U.S. warfighting capability to commercial AI and chip ecosystems, and that hardwires us to Silicon Valley and the global semiconductor chain. All of this is in the logic of deterrence and escalation. So if you're looking past all of the optimism, GenAI.mil is the moment the Pentagon openly commits to fighting, planning, and sensing through large-scale generative models as a default and not an experiment, and that's the shift. It's not robots on the battlefield yet, but models in every headshed, shaping how entire chains of command see the world and decide what to do about it. And on that note, I am going to watch Matthew Broderick tell a supercomputer how to play tic-tac-toe. This has been the Carry On Podcast with your host, Brad Colbert, the Iceman. Until next time, stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.